They went to war for a country that had never gone to war for them. December 1941, the United States entered World War II. Across the country, the machinery of war roared to life. Factories burned through the night. Newspapers shouted urgency and unity. Recruitment posters promised belonging to anyone willing to wear the uniform. Far from the cities, far from the speeches and parades, something quieter happened. On reservations scattered across deserts, plains, forests, and mountains, Native Americans began to enlist. Many came from communities without electricity, without running water, without paved roads. Some lived under federal authority that still treated them as wards rather than citizens. Some were denied the right to vote. Others lived under laws that allowed their children to be taken, their language suppressed, their families relocated without consent. And yet, tens of thousands stepped forward, not as a gesture, not as symbolism. More than 44,000 Native Americans served in World War II, from a population barely exceeding 350,000. That number forces a question history rarely pauses to ask. Why would a people who had been displaced, confined, and systematically erased choose to fight for the nation that had done it? To understand that decision, it helps to understand that for Native Americans, World War II did not begin in 1941. It was simply the latest chapter. Long before Pearl Harbor, Native communities had already been shaped by war. Forced marches, broken treaties, armed removals. Entire nations pushed off their land under military supervision. Children sent to boarding schools where their language was beaten out of them. Haircut, names replaced. Identity treated as a defect. War was not abstract. It was inherited. Grandparents remembered massacres. Parents remembered soldiers arriving not to protect, but to remove. The federal government was not an idea. It was a presence, often hostile, often unpredictable, rarely accountable. Reservations before the war were defined by absence. Absence of opportunity, absence of political power, absence of trust. Poverty was not accidental. It was engineered. Jobs were scarce. Education limited. Healthcare unreliable. Federal authority decided where people could live, how they could farm, which traditions were allowed to survive. So when the world collapsed into global war, Native Americans did not encounter violence as something new. They recognized it. This is why the common explanation that they enlisted out of patriotism never fully holds. Many felt little loyalty to the federal government. Some did not speak fluent English. Few were motivated by ideology or propaganda. They were not rushing to defend an abstract concept overseas. What drove them was older. Across tribes, warrior traditions did not glorify killing. They emphasized responsibility, endurance, protection of the community. The understanding that when danger comes, you face it, not because of loyalty to a flag, but because survival has always demanded readiness. There was also a colder calculation. If the world collapsed into total war, there would be no sanctuary left. Reservations had never been safe before. There was no reason to believe they would be spared now. They were not fighting for America. They were fighting because fighting had always been part of survival. Once in uniform, something unexpected happened. The very knowledge the country had spent generations trying to erase became invaluable. Indigenous languages, long treated as barriers to progress, were suddenly transformed into weapons. Navajo, Comanche, Choctaw, Lakota, and others became the backbone of battlefield communication. Their languages were unwritten, contextual, inseparable from culture. Enemy cryptographers could not break them. Messages moved faster than machines. Entire operations depended on voices the government had once tried to silence. And yet, that service remained classified for decades. The code talkers returned home as civilians, no parades, no headlines. In many cases, no ability to even tell their families what they had done. Their voices carried the war. Their stories were buried. But language was only part of it. Native Americans were disproportionately assigned to roles that required patience, silence, and an intimate relationship with terrain. Scouts, snipers, pathfinders, reconnaissance units, men sent ahead of the main force, often alone or in small teams. They excelled in jungles, forests, mountains, places where visibility collapsed and modern doctrine failed, not because of technology, because of mindset. They moved without disturbing the land, read terrain like a living record, chose patience over firepower, hunted patterns instead of chasing targets. Modern armies relied on knowledge they had once dismissed as primitive. Some of the missions they participated in were never fully recorded. Units carried vague designations. Operations produced results without documentation, not because they failed, because they were inconvenient. They challenged the idea that progress alone wins wars. They suggested that survival sometimes comes from memory, not innovation. When the war ended in 1945, victory celebrations swept the country. For many Native veterans, nothing changed. No land was returned, no treaties revisited, no economic transformation followed. Many returned to the same poverty they had left, now carrying the weight of war. Overseas, they had been trusted with lives and intelligence. At home, they were still marginalized. In uniform, they were assets. Out of uniform, they were invisible again. There was trauma, but little language for it. No culturally grounded support. No recognition that warrior identity does not disappear when a war ends. Some withdrew into silence. Some isolated themselves. Some disappeared from public record entirely. The system knew how to use them. It never learned how to repay them. Their knowledge was effective, but uncomfortable. Their contribution did not fit neatly into a victory story built around industry, generals, and machines, so history minimized them. Again, there were no grand monuments, no decisive ending, no restoration of what had been taken before the war ever began. They did not lose a battle. They did not lose the war. They lost visibility. History remembers the weapons. It remembers the generals. It remembers the victory. It rarely remembers the people who had already survived conquest before the war even began. They went to war for a country that had never gone to war for them. And when the fighting ended, the silence returned. Not because they had nothing to say, but because history was never built to listen. What made this silence especially heavy was that it followed a moment of undeniable usefulness. For a brief period during the war, Native Americans were not marginal. They were essential. Commanders did not speak in terms of diversity or inclusion. They spoke in terms of results, and the results were clear. Indigenous soldiers delivered outcomes in environments where doctrine failed. Forests, jungles, mountains, places where radios went dead and maps lost meaning. In those spaces, the war stripped itself down to its oldest form: observation, patience, restraint, timing. These were not skills learned quickly. They were inherited. Many Native veterans later explained that combat felt disturbingly familiar, not because it was easy, but because it followed patterns their cultures had understood for generations. The land was not something to dominate. It was something to listen to. Movement was not constant. Stillness mattered. Silence carried information. This way of thinking did not originate in military academies. It came from subsistence, from hunting not as sport, but as survival, from understanding that reckless force did not guarantee success. Sometimes it guaranteed exposure. This understanding saved lives, yet it also deepened the contradiction at the heart of their service. The same institutions that depended on indigenous knowledge during war continued to suppress indigenous autonomy at home. Federal policies did not change because Native Americans had proven their value. Reservations remained underfunded. Land disputes remained unresolved. Political rights remained unevenly enforced. Service did not purchase equality. Instead, it created a new kind of fracture. Many veterans returned carrying a double burden. They had proven themselves capable within the most extreme system the nation possessed: war. Yet they returned to communities still treated as incapable of self-determination. This dissonance was difficult to articulate even among themselves. Some spoke of anger, others of exhaustion. Many chose silence. That silence was often mistaken for assimilation. In reality, it was containment. The post-war United States celebrated unity, but unity required simplification. It required stories that moved cleanly from sacrifice to reward. Native American service complicated that narrative. Their sacrifice did not result in structural change. Their reward was conditional recognition, often delayed and incomplete. When benefits were distributed through the GI Bill, access was uneven. Geographic isolation, discrimination, and bureaucratic barriers prevented many Native veterans from receiving the same educational and housing opportunities afforded to others. The war had promised a path forward. For many, it ended at the reservation boundary. And still, something endured. Within families and communities, the memory of service was preserved quietly. Photographs, medals kept in drawers, stories told selectively, often without dates or names, not because they lacked pride, but because pride without justice felt unfinished. Children grew up knowing their fathers and grandfathers had gone somewhere far away and done something important. They also grew up watching those same men struggle to reconcile that importance with the reality waiting for them at home. This tension did not disappear with time. It carried forward into future conflicts. When the United States went to war again in Korea, in Vietnam, and beyond, Native Americans continued to enlist at high rates. The reasons were familiar: economic necessity, warrior tradition, a belief that standing aside had never offered protection. The pattern repeated: use, silence, delay. Only decades later did formal recognition begin to catch up. Congressional medals, public ceremonies, museum exhibits. These gestures mattered. They validated stories that had long been doubted. They gave names to contributions that had been deliberately obscured. But recognition, delayed, has limits. For many veterans, it arrived after health had declined, after families had scattered, after the context that gave meaning to service had already faded. Honor, when separated from accountability, feels symbolic rather than restorative. The deeper question remained unanswered. What does a nation owe people whose knowledge it relies on, but whose autonomy it refuses to respect? World War II did not resolve this question. It exposed it. The war revealed that indigenous knowledge was not obsolete. It was incompatible with a system that valued control over understanding. During crisis, the system bent. Afterward, it returned to form. This cycle explains why Native American military history often appears fragmented. Individual stories surface. Units are mentioned briefly. Contributions are acknowledged without being integrated into the larger narrative. The result is partial memory. Selective memory. History tends to remember what reinforces continuity. It forgets what challenges structure. Native Americans in World War II challenged structure by existing as proof that survival does not always belong to the most advanced system, but to the most adaptive one. They demonstrated that progress is not a straight line. That erasure does not equal disappearance. That knowledge survives suppression in ways institutions cannot fully control. And perhaps that is why their story continues to resist simplification. It does not end in victory. It does not end in defeat. It does not end in reconciliation. It ends in awareness. Awareness that a people who had already endured conquest, removal, and erasure still chose to stand in a global conflict that did not promise to treat them differently afterward. They did not fight because they believed the system had changed. They fought because they understood something deeper. That survival has never waited for permission. And history, as it is usually written, rarely makes space for those who survive without its approval. This is why their story matters, not as a footnote, not as a symbol, but as a measure of contradiction at the center of modern history, a nation that relied on a people it had tried to erase, a war that proved their value without restoring their rights, a silence that followed not because nothing happened, but because too much did. They went to war for a country that had never gone to war for them. And long after the gunfire stopped, they continued to live with the consequences of being seen only when necessary and forgotten when inconvenient.